Welcome. Today, we're going to talk about the component of a scientific writing. So, before I go ahead, I would like to recap the last class where we thought about characteristics of scientific research. We mentioned verification, the characteristics of verification, objectivity, empiricism, non-ethical, use of precision, high precision and accuracy, use of control. So today, we're going to look at components of the scientific research. So the first component is what we call background to the study. So this is the first component of scientific research, and this is a section where the researcher introduces the topic and really provide context to the topic under study. The background to the study answers the question of why is this study necessary? Why should we go ahead with this study? So this is one major. It helps to one major question a researcher asks. So this question helps the reader to really understand what the topic is all about. What the topic is all about, what is already known about the issue, what the problem is, and why the problem really matters. Why should we at all, out of all the numerous problems that exist, why does this one matter? And what is the gap that exists in the knowledge about you know, this issue? So I would like to say that most times students begin the background with definitions. No, the background is not just definitions, it's not just random collection of facts, it is not just the results of all of your study or what others have done. It is not your personal opinion about things. No, the background really does with facts. As much as you state the problems, you should be able to make references to some of these problems. You should be able to logically lead your reader to the research problem. What's actually the problem? Because we do research because we want to find solutions to a problem, or want to provide solutions to, want to use new methods, solutions to certain problems that have existed. So how does the background look like? It is important for students to understand the structure of the background such that anywhere, anytime, if you're asked to organize the background to the study of your work, or you're working on a research, your thesis, your final year project, you should be able to understand how to organize your research. So number one is you have to introduce the general topic. What is a topic? Like broad topic. Then the second thing is you have to narrow it down. In narrowing down, you discuss specific issues, the trends, the statistics, the reports on that issue, right? The third one is you try to identify the problems. What is actually wrong? What is missing? Why is this concerning? So these are what you try to point out here. And the fourth one is you show the gap. What's the gap? What do we know about this before? What have previous studies addressed concerning these studies before, and what have not been addressed? So this is the gap in knowledge. Then the final thing in your background, it leads you to your study. You end with a statement that justifies your research. Now, we're going to look at a typical public health problems, and we're going to, look at the structures we've mentioned and try to arrange this topic, try to arrange this topic using the structure of the background we've highlighted. So, assuming that we are looking at ultra processed food consumption among adolescents in Imo State, Nigeria. Assuming that's the topic we're looking at, how do we arrange the background to study? So the first step you have to do is you start broad. We're looking at ultra processed food consumption, and we know that it's one of the risk factors for non-communicable disease. You can start with statement like non-communicable diseases such as obesity, overweight, diabetes are increasing globally, particularly among young people. This is overall, this is a broad issue. Now, the second thing you have to do is you start narrowing down this issue. Remember, you've mentioned non-communicable diseases, so narrow it down. Then you look at statements. You can make statement like dietary patterns, have really changed significantly with increased consumption of ultra processed foods, which are high in sugar, salt, unhealthy fats. You're trying to narrow it down. You've narrowed it down to ultra, you know, processed food consumption. So what is the problem? You try to identify the problem. So is it about the ultra processed food? What's the problem? So here you look at statements like adolescents are, particularly vulnerable to peer influence, peer pressure, aggressive marketing, and, wide access to packaged foods. You see that? So in the next step, you show the gap. What's the gap? What has been done in previous studies and what do we not know? So you can go ahead to say, although several studies, have examined dietary patterns in developing countries, but yet there's limited data on ultra processed food consumption. You see that among adolescents in Nigerian, urban setting or rural setting or in just Nigerian setting. Then you can lead us to your research, which would now come, as therefore this study aims to assess the prevalence and determinant of ultra processed food consumption among young adults or adolescents in Imo State, Nigeria. You see that? So you've started from there, from the broad to the problem, what is the gap, and you've narrowed it down. And then you can now justify the reasons, why you're doing that. So what are the key characteristics of a good background? So a good background should be logical. You don't just say what should be at the end, at the beginning of your background to study. Someone who is not even a scientific researcher should be able to, look at what you've written and they would like to know more. It should be logical. Then secondly, your background should be supported with references. It is not just your personal opinion. As much as you can talk about, high ultra processed food consumption, access to some of these foods, aggressive marketing, show us data, put references to show us that these things you're saying are not really your personal opinions, right? So there are certain mistakes students do while they are writing their background to study. Number one is they write too generally without narrowing down. You just look at non-communicable disease, but you're looking at your study is based on ultra processed food consumption. You start telling us things about non-communicable disease. Number two is that they do not identify research gaps. Yes, students do not tell us what has been known about that issue. Nothing. You just land on that. You have to tell us what has been known. Then you have to use references, statistics. This is where you tell us. So statistics, this is where you tell us that the prevalence rate of obesity or overweight, or it used to be in the past 10 years, according to trend, 17%, but now it's over 35%. These are things that support your argument, the issue you're trying to, state. So also the mistakes that students do is that they just jump straight to the objective without proper context. You don't provide context. Why should we look at ultra processed food consumption among adolescents? You don't tell us, okay, in developing countries, it has not been studied. Other studies has been talking about that. You have to provide context. And then what students also do is that they write based on opinion. Hey, sometimes when you tell students, the reason why I'm doing this research is because my mother had diabetes or my dad died of diabetes. Yes, that could be a personal experience, but it's not strong enough, to give an argument enough strength for us to believe that this issue is necessary. So you have to back it up with, in Nigeria, about 35% or 40% of adults suffer from diabetes. Then it would, the issue would have weight. So the questions that can simply be asked that point you out to some of these things we've said is why, what is happening? That's the question. What is happening? We've talked about non-communicable disease on the increase. Why is it a problem? We've talked about the impact on healthcare system, and healthcare individual have to spend money out of pocket. So why does it matter, right? So, and then you also look at what is missing. What don't we know? Yes, we've known this data in southeastern Nigeria, but it has not been known. Nothing has been known about this in southwestern Nigeria. So that's what is missing. Why is the study needed? Why is it necessary? So these are things that could guide you in writing the background to your study. So the background to study prepares the reader for everything that follows. Every single thing that follows throughout your research project work. That's what the background to study prepares you. Now, it's important to note that it's important to know that research questions is also necessary in your background to study, in the introduction to your research. So apart from background to study, you also look at the statement of problems, you look at objectives of your study, your research questions, why should you carry out that study, that's justification of your study, why is it significant, the scope of your studies, who are involved, where are you doing it, geographical context. These are things that you need to do in the first component of your research. So beyond background to study, which is under your introduction, you have statement of problems, you have your research questions, and the research question is also a place to begin because it helps you to understand the necessary things to include in your research. So I like to say that research questions are really, your research objectives in question forms, right? So for example, if I have three research objectives for my study, if I want to understand the nutritional status of adolescents in Imo State, Nigeria. That's one of my objectives. And then I want to look at the factors that influence, ultra processed food consumption. That's another objective. And then I also want to look at, maybe the school food environment, if there are access to some of this food. That's another objective of my study. So research questions usually come in the form of question form of that objective. So in my research questions, I would like to look at what is the nutritional status of young adults or adolescents or your target group in Imo State. I'd like to know what are the factors that influence adolescents' consumption of ultra processed food. I'll look at what are the access to, availability or accessibility of ultra processed foods, for these young adults. Now, I would like to say that research questions have these three of these attributes. Number one, yeah, is that it has to address something significant, issues and questions that relate to the interests of a broad community. For example, we know within the COVID-19 pandemic era, a lot of research stemmed up as a result of that occurrence, because at that point in time, that is really what mattered to the broad communities. Yes, other researches were going on, but it makes it more relevant, right, when it's of great interest to a broad community of people, questions that will arise from real world situations, and all of that. So now it also has to address a question that has not been answered. So if a question has been answered by research, there's no need making that a research question, right? Okay, for example, you talk about, does mosquito cause malaria? of course, we know that this question has been answered, so it's not a valid research question. Now, another thing we look at in research question is that the question has to be well researchable. Something you can answer by doing research. That's what we mean by, question has to be researchable. At the end of that research, would you be able to answer that question based on, the research you've carried out? If that is so, then, those if you have research questions, it becomes valid if it has satisfied three of these conditions. Now we move to the second component of your the scientific research, which is the literature review. So the literature review is simply the body of academic research about a particular issue. This time around, issue or subject under study. So these are cumulative information, things around that issue that has been disseminated, that has been published, that the public have access to, through publication. It could be through publications, through books, journals, websites, and the rest of it. What are the available information as regards to that topic of interest? This is what, literature review is: a cumulative body of information about it. So in searching out for literatures from previous research, it is very, very important to be specific. This is why where students also find it very difficult. You hear them tell you, oh, Miss Judith, we find it difficult to, find information about our research topic. There's nothing on the internet about it. But the point is that sometimes it could be that in the search of literature, students were not specific. There are things that would help you. There are such words optimization on the internet that could help you search out for research, literature review. I also want to state that literature review, because I often get this sometimes. When you look at literature review of students, you're seeing, sources from blogs and vlogs and the rest of it, unverified sources. So literature review has to highlight like key debates, ideas that can be verified, right? Verified by carrying out research. That's what literature review. These are information that are of high interest to any scientific researcher who is gathering literature. Research works have been done previously in the past. So it's important to know that you don't just go to, blogs to pick up informations, because it may not be verified. They have not gone through, scientific scrutiny and investigation before such conclusion is was arrived at, right? So I also want to state that see literature review, because here students usually find it difficult. You see them feeding in the literature review section of their research work with all sorts of information, including the ones that are not even necessary. So consider literature review like you're in a round table discussion. Consider if we're talking about non-communicable disease, would it be appropriate to talk about things that are not, within context? We're talking about non-communicable disease and factors that can affect it, and you're seeing in the literature review component of, a student's work, where they're talking about infectious diseases and all of that. Just imagine yourself in a round table talking about it. It feels off. That views may be considered as out of point, out of what is, out of discussion. So this is exactly how, literature review should be treated. Things, informations that should be included should be of interest to the researcher, should be related. And then in writing, because we know that literature review, as much as information you can get in writing, it doesn't have to be boring. It should be engaging, right? it should be understood by groups of people, whether they are researchers or not. When they pick up the literature review component of your research work, they should be able to understand it. They should be able to want to read on and read on and read on, assimilate the information therein. So in literature review, we have the conceptual framework. Here you look at all the concepts of that work. Look at that, the example we've given previously, that assuming that you're working on ultra processed food consumption among young adults in Imo State. So, what are the concepts of this work? We expect that in the literature conceptual framework of your study, you should talk about ultra processed foods, categories of ultra processed. What do we need to know about ultra processed foods, right? You should talk about young adults or adolescents according to WHO, like what's the age range. We should know things about young adults, right? And these are, looking at that topic, these are some of the key concepts in that topic. So look at the conceptual framework. Then it's also important to look at previous studies. In Of course, a literature review tries to see what other researchers views about the issue you're talking about. So in literature review, it's important to include key key research results and findings that would help you, carry out your own current research. Yeah, it's advisable, to look at some key findings, the authors, where the studies was carried out, what are the key findings, what were the study designs, right? So it's also recommended, it's recommended rather, to try to put this information on, on a table, so that anyone who is reading your work will just take a glance through the table and look at what you've written. So the author, the year, the location of the study, the objective of the study, the research findings, the results and the conclusion. As much as you can, just put them in a tabular form and note out some of the key findings. You can have as much as 10 authors, 12, 15 authors, but those, their work should be related to what you're doing. That way, we're able to look at diverse approaches to that issue, where different locations the work has been carried out, the year, different study designs that have been used in that work. So we in literature review, we also talk about the theoretical framework. So here in theoretical framework, we talk about theories that are relevant to that research you're carrying out. Now, if you're looking at a study that has to do with um you're looking at a study that has to do with in um you're looking at the evaluation of, say, nutrition education, right? For example, you're looking at it, evaluation of nutrition education among young adults, or among mothers, women of reproductive age, on breastfeeding, right? So now you know that the issue at stake is, you're looking at how nutrition education has, like, effectiveness or the impact of nutrition education on how mothers breastfeed their children. So if you're looking at that, what are the theories that could explain, how fast or how effective or efficient it is, for women to adopt adequate breastfeeding practices based on the nutrition education. So in theories, we look at common theories like the health belief models. We also look at social cognitive theory. There are a lot of them, but those theories can be explained. It could be one or two theories that are relevant that explains. So theories are explained for our studying, for contextual, like the study we're using for this a theory that can explain the reasons why consumption of ultra food, sorry, breastfeeding practices can be enhanced or optimized, how nutrition education can pass that information, what are the factors that influence mothers to quickly adopt, and what are the things that explains the reason why breastfeeding mothers or women of reproductive age can adopt proper breastfeeding behaviors. So literature review in summary helps us to know what is already known about that issue under study and what has not been known. It also can look at criticisms, right? Things that have worked in the past concerning that issue and things that have not worked and all of that. So we move to the third component of scientific writing, and that is the methodology. So in the methodology, this aspect component of scientific writing helps a researcher to understand how the work will be carried out. I call this the foundation of any research work, right? So the methodology of any research work should follow a simple, clear steps, very simple and clear, such that if any researcher wants to repeat or replicate the research somewhere else using the same methods, they'll be able to do so without confusion. So methodology include the following, but they are not, limited to the design of your research, so that your research design, the sample, the method of, sample selection, look at your data collection, method of data analysis, organization of your data, and all of those. So for this class, we're going to look at 5 key components of methodology: the research design, the sample and method of sample selection. You look at data collection, the organization of your data, and the method of data analysis. So these are the 5 key components of methodology we're going to talk about in this class. So let's dive in right in. What is research design? So imagine that you want to build a house. Before you build a house, what you have is you have to draw out a plan for the building of that house, right? So this is exactly what your research design is. So the research design is the overall plan or the blueprint of your study. So the design answers questions like, what type of study am I conducting? That is one of the questions in the research design answers. So research design describes whether your study is quantitative or qualitative, right? It describes whether the variables are observed. If you're using an observation method, you're going to influence or manipulate your variables. It also answers when and how your data will be collected or you are collected. So let's look at common types of research design. I'm not going to touch up briefly on them. You can look up for you can read subsequently for types of research designs on your own later in your private study. So we have the descriptive design study. We also call that the cross-sectional study design. So what this design does is it describes a situation at one point in time, the interest on the study, it describes it at one point in time. So what that means is whatever data you've collected is necessary, like it's valuable for that point in time where it's collected. You can't use it to conclude over a period of time. So if, for example, a study was carried out in raining season, sometimes the seasons in which studies are carried out can affect the result of study. So you can't use the result of that study, you can't really use it to conclude for studies that are carried out in the dry seasons, because there may be differences because of seasonal variations, right? So descriptive, it just tells us what it is at that point in time. So we go to experimental study designs. Here the researcher is usually in charge. You can manipulate variables. You can look at consumption of ultra processed foods, for example, or nutrition education, and then you say, I'm going to provide nutrition education to this group while I'm not. So you see the researcher manipulate the variable, right? Recipient of nutrition education is one of your variables if you're looking at how nutrition education affects breastfeeding practices. So you can decide to manipulate it. It's experimental, and in the manipulation, you as you manipulate, you look out for the changes that occur as a result of that manipulation. All right. So we also look at study designs. We call this quasi experimental. So these are interventions without full randomization, unlike the experimental. We also look at cohort study. Cohort study has to do with your your study is it uses sorry it engages participant over time, right? We also look at case control studies, where you compare people with or without a particular condition, say people who smoke to people who don't smoke, people with diabetes and people without diabetes. So that's a case control study. So we also look at design qualitative designs that experience. The focus of qualitative design is it tries to understand the reason why things happen. So it tries to understand, explore meanings to incidents. So now let's look at a study example in order to buttress this explanation of this study design. We're going to look at a study that assesses the prevalence of ultra processed food consumption among adolescents in Imo State. To look at this study would use a descriptive cross-sectional design. Why? Because the data are collected at that point in time. It just wants to find out ultra processed food consumption among young adolescents in Lagos, and that's all, right? So let's look at another example. A study that is testing whether nutrition education reduces sugar drink consumption, sweetened, beverage conju- con- consumption. This study would likely use the experimental or the quasi-experimental study design, where it would, look at people who are not receiving nutrition education versus people that won't receive that nutrition education. So this is quasi experimental or experimental because an intervention is introduced in this research design. So the research design is simply the strategies that guides your study. That's what your research design is. So we look at the sample and the method of sample selection. So before we go ahead, we'd like to look at what a sample is. So a sample is just a smaller group selected from a larger population, right? That's a sample. And usually it's advisable in research that the sample should at least be representative of the larger sample, right? So if for example you're looking at the nutrient component of the oil component of white, like yam, and you're to use yam, of course you can't use the whole tubers of yam, right? What you have to do is, if you want to take a sample of that yam, it's advisable to cut the yam into pieces from the head to the tail, the middle, and take out each of these components. From the head you take out, from the middle of the yam you take out, and from the tail of the yam you take out, and then you can decide to pulverize it before you can go ahead to run the experiment to check out analyze the fat and oil component of that yam. So that sample of yam that you've taken is quite representative of the whole of the yam, because you took out from all of the parts. So a population is the entire group you want to study. Yes, entire group. And of course, in real life situations, it's nearly impractical to study the whole population. So that's why sample is actually important. You collect the portion that you want to collect data from. And the reasons why we usually sample is because studying the entire population, I mean, if you're looking at young adults in Imo State, how many of them, they run a hundred of thousands, you may not be able to, run that because of cost. It's expensive, it's almost impractical. So that's why it's advisable or cost effective to just sample out from the large population. So we look at the sampling selection or sampling techniques. So what is sampling technique? This is how your participants are chosen, right? I just described an example using a tube of yam, right? So there are two broad categories of sample selection. We have the probability sampling and the non-probability sampling. We're not going to go into details, but I would like to just mention the examples of probability sampling. Here in probability sampling, every individual has a chance, right? In the midst of 1,000 young adults, every of them has a chance, right? So examples of sampling using probability sampling, the examples of different types of probability sampling: you have the simple random sampling, you have the stratified sampling, you have the cluster sampling, the systematic sampling. These are all examples of probability sampling. Then for non-probability sampling, here in this sampling technique, not everyone has equal chance, right? So you employ sampling techniques like the convenience sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling. These are all examples of non-probability sampling. So for example, if you want to study the body mass index among secondary school students in Lagos, Nigeria, that population, every secondary school student has a chance, right, to be sampled, to be chosen, to be selected. If you have a sample of 300 students, you can decide to just use random sampling, just pick randomly. You can use the balloting system, just select students differently from different classes. All of them have the chances, to be selected. So if you're looking at 300 students out of that 1,000, you can decide to just choose randomly from each class, maybe according to their class size or the rest. But if you want to study, if you're studying about experiences of gambling recovery, or say commercial sex workers, you would definitely not use probability sampling. Why? Because not everybody stands the equal chance. What you need is people who are recovering from gambling addiction, people who are commercial sex workers. These are people you collect your samples. So you do not waste any time. You just go specifically to these people because they have experience of the issues that you're trying to study. Now, we go to the third component of methodology, which is the method of data collection.